history of Bugatti through a designer's eye, I really have to refer to the Bugatti family being a family of artists. Already since the 1600s, it was Carlo Bugatti who was a very gifted furniture designer, jewelry designer, architect, and he was actually the one that moved the family that was originally living in Milan. He moved the family at the beginning of the 20th century to Paris. Why? Because Paris was the mecca of the arts at the time, and somebody like Carlo Bugatti felt, that's where I have to be, and that's where I have to locate the family to. And so the two boys, Rembrandt Bugatti and Ettore Bugatti, really grew up in Paris and became artists themselves. Rembrandt Bugatti became an extremely talented sculptor for animals that he just sculpted freehand. Also, that's where the dancing elephant, for example, comes from. And those sculptures are today really some of the most valuable items that you can find in the sculpting world. If you happen to be in possession of a real bronze sculpture of Rembrandt Bugatti, it's probably worth more than an actual Bugatti automobile. And then we come to Ettore Bugatti, the founder of Bugatti 110 years ago. The English used to call Ettore Bugatti the artist engineer. And then when you really look, just as one example, at an 8-cylinder inline engine of the time of the 1920s, this is really like a work of cubistic art. Look at all the other engines at the time, where the lines all over the place. This was so minimalistic, almost with a certain Bauhaus philosophy. And also, the invention of the aluminum wheel, as you see here of the Type 35, also has the Bauhaus quality. And so many wheels today are still linking back to this wheel that was invented more than 100 years ago. This is a third example of the ingenuity of Ettore Bugatti, how far he went to really make things work and make things successful. This is a hollow forged axle, which was a masterpiece in forging on the race cars at the time, on the Grand Prix cars. Hollow forged, hollow bent, then becoming a full material, then conically hollow again, and then becoming full material for the axle connection. So these kind of masterpieces, they spoke really for the craftsmanship of Molsheim at the time, but they speak also for the character of Ettore Bugatti. Things had to be exactly the way how he felt they need to be done, or he wouldn't do them at all. And for that, I want to give you a couple of examples. Ettore Bugatti really stood for the brand. His name stood for the brand. And this was quite unusual at the time. Why? He identified with the brand how we only knew that at that time, or a little bit later with Coco Chanel. She stood for that brand. Or take it into modern times. Steve Jobs, for example, stood for Apple. No? Elon Musk stands for Tesla. Ettore Bugatti at that time was Bugatti. He himself as a person, so unique, a real patron, and really running the Molsheim enterprise as his family, his personal project, but quite outspoken and also quite flamboyant in character. And if he didn't like something, he needed to change that immediately. If he didn't like the pasta that was delivered in the evening, he started everything by raising chicken here in Molsheim to get the perfect egg. And then from there, the pasta was created with a self-constructed pasta machine that was run with a Type 46 steering wheel. And then the perfect pasta was there, and then in the evening there was pasta. But mind you, the pasta was served on self-designed tableware, napkins, napkin rings, cutlery, glasses, everything from scratch, everything designed in-house by Ettore Bugatti. And then sometimes a client would also come in the evening and be invited to have dinner with the family. But mind you, also, if the client didn't have table manners, or would lick his knife or something like this, it could very well be that he had to go home and didn't receive the car. So this was Ettore Bugatti and the way how he looked upon life. This is the second example. The way how you know in Formula One paddocks today how guests are hosted, you know, and the whole atmosphere, and everybody has his own temple of hosting journalists and doing media work. Ettore Bugatti invented that at the time, at the beginning of the 1920s. He came uniquely to the races with a huge tent, with the advantage that all the mechanics had a chance to work in the shade. The journalists could speak to the drivers, but there were also 2 Italian chefs cooking for everybody. This was completely unique at the time, but it was very typical Ettore Bugatti lifestyle, or the way how he saw things. And coming back to ingenuity, Ettore Bugatti invented the successful and the intelligent power-to-weight philosophy in a time when 4 to 5 liter monsters really were successful in the early 1920s. It was Ettore Bugatti that came with a 1.4 liter engine, ultra light, with a Type 13 at the time, and was driving circles around those cars. You know, we speak a lot about Colin Chapman in the 60s and his power-to-weight philosophy, but it was really Ettore Bugatti at the beginning of the 1920s who invented this philosophy: weight is the enemy. Now, a small anecdote, since we are at the Type 13, in this case the racing version, which was called Brescia. A lot of people think that the horseshoe shape and the horseshoe grille that you see on Bugattis today is due to the passion of Ettore Bugatti for horses. But the true story is different. The Type 13 had an egg-shaped grille because the father of Ettore Bugatti, Carlo, was of the opinion that the egg is the perfect shape in nature. And that's why the first grills really looked like this. But then what happened, for better performance, the center of gravity had to be lowered and dropped. And when you do that, the egg was cut off on the bottom. And what happened then? Power increased. That's why the egg had to be widened on the top, you know, left and right, and with compressors and so on. And in the end, you were left with the horseshoe grill, how you know it today, or all the abstractions, how you know them today. Brings us to Grand Prix racing and the ultimate icon, no, for Bugatti, the Type 35 that you all know. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday is not a quote from Ettore Bugatti. It was an English gentleman that came up with that sentence, but the trick was Ettore Bugatti was acting and working along that sentence. Because he was the one not only being ultra successful with his factory team, throughout the whole period of the 1920s, so many Grand Prix were won by the factory riders, but the magic of it was that Ettore Bugatti, or Bugatti, was the only company at the time that pretty much sold Type 35 Grand Prix cars to the wealthy privateer. And that created the success for Bugatti at the time, because so many privateers had a chance to get a car that was so close to the actual Grand Prix factory cars that on a good day they even had a chance to be more successful than the factory riders, or to win a Grand Prix even. And that was obviously something very attractive to this gentleman sport that it certainly was still in the 1920s. After the 1920s, or at the end of the 1920s, what happened in October 1929? There was the world economic crisis. And as a consequence of that, unions became, for example, fairly strong also here in Molsheim and all the economic turmoil. And now that I described the character of Ettore Bugatti to you, you can imagine Ettore Bugatti could not handle really dealing with the unions. Things in his own stable had to run the way how he thought they had to run. So that led to a little bit of frustration, we believe, of him, and him retreating to Paris more and more. And looking after his own private projects like record planes, record boats, trains, that he did partially for other companies. And what happened then? Who ran the business in Molsheim at the beginning of the 1930s? It was his son, Jean Bugatti. And I told you in the beginning we are looking at this through a designer's eye, and I have to speak about Jean Bugatti because he's so incremental. We even think that he is as important as Ettore Bugatti, and I'm going to show you in a moment why we think that. Jean Bugatti was unbelievably gifted when it came to styling and proportion and a feeling for elegance. As an example of that, look at this picture. What do you notice about all these limousines? And here are the race cars then of the 1920s. They all have a similar aesthetic, no? Because they were all done around the 1920s. They were all done under Ettore supervision. So the limousines of Ettore Bugatti really looked quite a bit more like coaches on wheels. The coach building industry was only learning to apply coaches onto a chassis. You know, Bugatti would manufacture the chassis, the engine, the drivetrain, and then the coach building industry, instead of horses pulling this thing, was applying this onto the chassis. This was usus, this was normal procedure in the 1920s. And now I'm going to show you how that changed with Jean Bugatti. How all of a sudden proportions became magnificent, wonderful. Line work was so elegant, you know, really sporty, sexy cars came to life. And this is due to Jean Bugatti's influence. And even the race cars, in this case the Type 51, as a re-bodied touring car, had a certain elegance and presence on the road, and makes it actually one of the most precious cars in Bugatti history today. Another example is the Type 50 Surprofilé or Super Profilé. Look at the cabin of this, in design lingo you call this greenhouse. How fast this cabin is. It's an A-pillar that is almost as modern, as fast as today's cars on the road now. From here you can almost make a modern day car out of it. This was the influence of Jean Bugatti, despite the aerodynamic effects. And speaking about aerodynamics, there was a first attempt of Ettore Bugatti to understand aerodynamics from the airplane industry. And he was trying to apply that to cars. This was actually the predecessor of the Type 35 race car. But unfortunately, the real aerodynamics were not completely understood, and this car actually produced lift instead of downforce. Now, when I show you that with Jean Bugatti, Jean made a second attempt some 15 years later with the Type 57 tank, and actually this car won Le Mans 2 times due to its aerodynamic in the days. A little bit about values. We always think that those cars are maybe the most valuable. It's questionable, it's sometimes difficult. Why? Because race cars, there's a famous sentence, the best race car is the one that wins and goes over the finish line and then breaks apart. And that's a similar thing with the Type 35. It is impossible to find a Type 35 that is completely original, because those cars were pretty much made for exchanging parts afterwards. You know, constantly new wheels, new engine, new chassis. So try to find an original Type 35. The best thing that can happen to you is maybe that you find a car that was driven by a Chiron and that was not toyed with after, was not modified after that success. Those are the most successful, or in price-wise, in value development, the most valuable Grand Prix race cars that we have. In contrast, the cars of Jean Bugatti, especially with the bodies of the 57 and the Aravis and the Galibiers and the Ventoux, they were at the time already quite precious, but they are even more precious today, and that's where we see a value development of those cars, because you really find 57s from Jean Bugatti that are complete. You know, one complete car, completely original. And that explains a little bit where values of these cars are developing now. Now we come to the absolute masterpiece of Jean Bugatti, and this was certainly the Type 57 Atlantique. Now, we explained that story since we did the show car, La Voiture Noire in Geneva 2019. We told that story a couple of times. Just to repeat, there were 4 Atlantiques ever built. The first one is the car of Peter Mullen, and probably the most valuable car. I talked to Peter Mullen this year in Pebble Beach, and the last offer that he received for his car was close to 100 million. The second most valuable car, I would venture to say, belongs to Ralph Lauren. He just won Concours d'Eleganza in Villa d'Est last year with his car. Why would we consider it's maybe not as precious as Peter's car? Is because originally the Pope Atlantic was light blue, and when Ralph Lauren restored his car, he decided to paint it black because at that time his black collection came out and he wanted to create a balance between his collection and this car. But other than that, extremely valuable, was never on the market for sale. The third car, the so-called Holzschuh Atlantic, is pretty much a replica, I have to say. Why do I say that? This car was, in the 1950s, was hit by a train, full on. Both people driving the car immediately were dead on the scene. The car was shattered in 1,000 pieces. Not very many pieces were left over, but what was left over, which maybe fits in one cardboard box, they used that to build up this car again. But just to show you the borderline crazy value development of Bugattis at the time, even this car, as a, let's say, replica, is going close to values of $10 million today. And now we come to the most intriguing car, and this is the personal car of Jean Bugatti. He drove that car here in Molsheim, La Voiture de Monsieur Jean. And this really existed. That was the only black car around. This is an official brochure. Those are photos here from the Vogue Mountains. And only he was allowed to drive that car, and the Grand Prix pilots, which were all his friends, were also allowed to borrow the car here and there. And the mystery is it, if you haven't heard yet about that story, that this car got lost when it was transported, when the Germans were invading the Alsace region, transported over to Bordeaux to escape basically. It went with the papers also onto the train, but it never arrived in Bordeaux and has not been seen since. And since then we speak about this car as the Automobile Bernsteinzimmer Bugattis, now the automotive amber room. And therefore I also brought a little clip.
I had so much still to live for, so much still to do. I grew up in a family of artists. I became an artist in turn. People say that in every great artist's life, there is always a special moment where they create something unique, something so remarkable that it will always be remembered. When I think back over all the cars we built, all the cars I have drawn, all the cars I have driven, for me, the greatest will always be the Atlantic. We only built 4 of these beautiful cars. The first belonged to Victor Rothschild, the second to Jacques Holzschuh, and the third to Richard Pope. I remember each of them, each absolutely unequaled in the richness of their histories and the beauty of their lives. But I remember the 4th most of all, a masterpiece of sophistication and elegance, a breathtaking black sculpture created in aluminium, outstanding in every detail. I was so impressed by the gracefulness of this car that I kept it as my personal Atlantic, La Voiture Noire. There was so much left to do, but I never had the chance. In 1940, history took over. To snatch it from the jaws of war, my Atlantic was sent from Molsheim to Bordeaux. It never arrived, and was never seen again. It lives on in myth as Bugatti's automotive amber room, and still inspires people all over the world. I wish I could create another car like it, inspired by today's technologies, and build the ultimate graceful GT for today.